These are a series of PowerPoint narrations for Florence Darlington Technical College for Biology 211, Anatomy and Physiology 2. We start this course with the endocrine system. I encourage you to use the course pack as you study through these materials. If you have it available right now, please turn to page 3 and follow along with me. When you came to this course, you probably most recently took Biology 210 or Anatomy and Physiology 1. In that course, we wrap up the nervous system by talking about central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. You may recall that these systems have quick responses. For instance, if you want your muscles to contract quickly, you send a message over your nervous system. When organs do their jobs, they often work by neurotransmitters as well. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers. They are found released by axon terminals of nerve cells, and they act upon neighboring cells, whether they are glands, organs, or muscles, or even other nerve cells. The endocrine system is where we start this course. This system tends to be a slower responding system, and it also uses chemical messengers, but this time these hormones travel through the bloodstream, not necessarily from one cell to the next, as we see with the nervous system. So let me give you an example of how the endocrine system tends to be a slower responding system. Growth takes months and years to accomplish. For instance, if you think of the overall size of the human body, babies are born at around 20 inches on average. Their bodies grow to 5 or 6 feet or even taller at the point at which we stop growing. So the rate at which we grow is slower compared to other things that work in our bodies like muscle contractions, but it does take years to accomplish that growth. So that's kind of how we think of the endocrine system as a slower system. We'll talk in more detail about specific examples of how the endocrine system works as we progress through this chapter. So let's take a moment to reflect back on Biology 210 and talk about how hormones are different from neurotransmitters. We know that neurotransmitters are chemicals released by axon terminals of nerve cells, and those neurotransmitters target a neighboring cell. The neighboring cell may in fact be another nerve cell, or the neighboring cell could be a muscle cell, a gland, or an organ. When the neurotransmitter binds to receptors on that neighboring cell's plasma membrane, that neurotransmitter brings about changes that occur inside the neighboring cell. So that neighboring cell may become excited, or that neighboring cell may remain at rest. Hormones work similarly. They oftentimes will bind to receptors on the plasma membranes of target cells, and it is necessary for those receptors to be present. Let me explain it to you this way. If you walk up to a house with no doorbell, and that's the only way to communicate with the people on the inside of that house, you really have no way to communicate unless you can ring that doorbell. That's how receptors work. You have to be able to bind to the receptor to bring about changes inside the cell. Now we're going to learn a little more about receptors in just a few minutes. So the thing to remember here is that hormones travel through the bloodstream, and they do target cells with receptors. Neurotransmitters, however, do not necessarily travel through the bloodstream. Instead, their goal is to leave the axon terminal of one cell and to target a neighboring cell to bring about changes in that cell. Let's also focus on endocrine glands versus exocrine glands. I think one thing to notice here is the prefix is certainly different between these two words. Exo means outside or to the outside of the body. Endo, of course, means to the interior or inside of the body. These exocrine glands that are pictured on the left do have a duct, not the quack-quack kind, but a tube that connects the gland to the outside surface of the body. In this example, we may see secretions of sweat being carried to the skin surface. Notice the endocrine gland, however, on the right. There is no ductwork or tubing here. These hormones released by the endocrine gland on the right are simply placed into the bloodstream, and they travel through from this gland into the bloodstream simply by diffusion. So no ducts over here when you think about endocrine glands. And of course, the release of the hormones is into the bloodstream, not into the exterior of the body. On the very bottom of your page, you'll notice there's a map of the major endocrine glands. As we travel throughout this course, you'll learn that this is not a complete list of endocrine glands. These are only the major endocrine glands that we're covering in this chapter. If you would like to label down through this picture, letter A on your picture is the pineal gland, sometimes called the pineal body. Letter B on your picture is called the posterior pituitary gland. Letter C is already labeled for you. It is anterior, but you'll want to go ahead and complete the terms there. Anterior pituitary gland. Letter D is the thyroid gland. You'll notice it's found here in the throat region. It lays over the trachea. Letter E is thymus, and you'll notice this one actually sits down further. It overlays the heart underneath the sternum. These two here are ones not to get confused. Letter F are the adrenal glands, or more specifically, the adrenal cortex. Letter G is the pancreas. And then we have gonads. H are ovaries in females. Letter I are the gonads in males. Of course, they're called testes. So you may want to pause here for just a moment and go ahead and complete those blanks on your course pack, page 3. Now, if you'll turn over to page 4 with me, let's talk a little more about hormones. We've already learned that hormones are chemical messengers, and they travel through the bloodstream to target areas. So a couple of keywords here. They are chemical messengers. That means they have a message to deliver. Some change will be brought about in the cells that they target. And they reach their target areas by traveling the bloodstream. Did you know that it takes a minute for the blood to circulate throughout the entire body and back to its origination point? So obviously these hormones traveling the bloodstream are not in a great big hurry because it takes some time to arrive at their destinations. So let's talk about how hormones communicate with their target cells. In order to understand how hormones target the destinations they're going to in the body, we need to understand the two chemical classifications of hormones. This is going to take you back to Bio 210 for just a moment. Some hormones are what we call amino acid-based hormones. Keep in mind, we know that amino acids are the building blocks for proteins. Now there's another class called steroids. And again, keep in mind that steroids are lipids in nature. So thinking about what you've learned about these two from a previous course, let's take a look at a picture of the plasma membrane. So first of all, protein-based hormones are large. Protein-based hormones would rip a hole in this double layer of phospholipids if they were to travel through this plasma membrane. So protein-based hormones cannot travel through the plasma membrane. They're going to dock on the outside with some type of receptor and relay their message to the inside of the cell. Now, by contrast, lipids, or steroids, are liked by the plasma membrane. You may recall that the interior of the plasma membrane in here is hydrophobic. That means the interior doesn't like water, but it does like fats. So those fat-based molecules that make up our steroid hormones are welcome to travel across. So two things to remember. Protein-based hormones are too big, so they have to stay on the outside. But lipids are liked by those phospholipid bilayers, so lipids can pass through. So size keeps your proteins out, and construction, what those lipid hormones are made of, allows those particular ones to travel straight on through to the interior of your cell. So now we understand that there's two types of chemical construction for hormones. So in order for a hormone to talk to its target cell, that target cell must carry a receptor for that hormone. You remember earlier I talked to you about having a doorbell in your house, and that might be the only way for someone outside to communicate with those on the inside. That's what a receptor does. It allows for the hormone to communicate with the target cell. No receptor, there's no communication. So we know that protein-based hormones are big. They're stuck on the outside. They cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer, so they're going to use something called the secondary messenger system. Lipids, because the phospholipid bilayer likes lipids, then we can use something called the direct gene activation mechanism. Let's talk about proteins first. Why can't proteins travel into your cell? They're too big. So here you notice a protein. It's this hormone here called epinephrine, and you'll notice it's binding with a receptor sitting on the plasma membrane of a cell. So I'm going to go ahead and label that plasma membrane. This is the outside of that cell, and this is the inside of that cell. So keep in mind, this is a protein-based hormone. It's too big to pass through the phospholipid bilayer. And so in order to communicate with this cell, it has to bind a receptor on the cell's membrane. The second thing to appreciate here is there is a receptor present. And if there was no receptor, this particular hormone would have no conversation with this cell. The other thing you may notice is how this hormone fits into the receptor site. The receptor site is built for that particular hormone. Other hormones may come along, but that receptor site is fit for that particular hormone. So what this means is kind of like a lock and key fit. You've probably learned about that before with enzymes and other proteins. That allows for communication between specific hormones and their receptors. So let's talk about some of the details that you see in this picture here. You notice when the first messenger, the hormone, binds to the receptor, there's a whole host of activity that occurs inside the cell. We're not going to talk about every single one of these activities, but we are going to focus on the second messenger down here. It is called CAMP. That stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP for short. So you've heard of ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. This is a different type of energy molecule called CAMP, adenosine monophosphate. When your hormone or first messenger binds to the receptor, it activates the creation of CAMP here inside your cell. That second messenger goes to turn on an enzyme called protein kinase. How do you know it's an enzyme? That ASE ending is a great reminder. It tells us it is an enzyme. So all it takes is for this hormone to ring the doorbell, right? When that hormone binds with the receptor on the outside surface of the cell, this host of activities changes inside your cell, including the creation of CAMP and protein kinases. Now, this particular cell may increase its rate of mitosis, or it may increase its rate of metabolism. So there is some change that will now come about inside the cell thanks to that first messenger or hormone binding the receptor on the plasma membrane. Let's talk about how steroid-based hormones communicate with their target cells. We know that steroids are lipids. Therefore, they can travel directly through the phospholipid bilayer and travel into your cell. So it's not the size here that's an issue, it's the composition of the hormone that allows it to travel into your cell. Now, steroid hormones are kind of like having relatives live next door. They don't ring the doorbell, they don't knock, they just open the door, they come right on in. In fact, they come all the way into the nucleus of the cell. It is inside the nucleus that the steroid hormone finds its receptor. You'll notice again that lock and key fit there, a very good binding point between those two. And when the receptor and steroid hormone are bound together, they will then activate DNA to begin transcription. And of course, transcription takes us to the next step, and we then perform translation. You've heard of transcription and translation before. What is the end goal? It is to make a new protein. So steroid hormones turn on protein synthesis. So that is the goal here of steroid-based hormones. There's only a handful of these that we'll discuss in this course. They are made by the adrenal glands, and they're made by the gonads. So we will learn that they are hormones like cortisol or cortisone, aldosterone, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. Notice those often have an ONE ending. Okay, so those are all steroid-based hormones. The rest of the hormones we discuss in this course, we will assume to be protein-based hormones. All right, so let's talk about hormone interactions. These come from your course pack on the top of page 5. When hormones give permission, they allow for another hormone to do their job. For instance, if a woman is trying to get pregnant, she may have her sex hormones tested. But in fact, her thyroid hormone has to give permission in order for her sex hormones to do their jobs. So some women who have fertility issues may take thyroid hormone supplements so the thyroid can give permission for her sex hormones to allow her cycle to operate correctly. To think about this in other terms, if a mom gives a 10-year-old permission to go to the store or to the movies, that permissiveness is allowing the next hormone to do its job. What do you think synergistic hormones do? They work together. Some great examples are those that have a common job or a common goal in mind. For example, glucagon and adrenaline both help to raise blood sugar levels. We'll talk about many examples of synergist as we work through this course. And then an antagonist here. Antagonists are those hormones that work how? They work opposite or against each other. Lots of examples in this chapter as well. Glucagon and insulin work against each other, as do parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. So we'll talk about several examples as we work through the next pages of this chapter. All right, about halfway down page 5, let's talk about 3 types of stimuli that can encourage hormone release. The first type there, humoral, is based on an old term, a several hundreds-year-old term called the humors. People oftentimes referred to the fluids of the body, like blood or bile, as the body's humors. So when we're talking about blood concentration of something, we are talking about humoral concentration. So let me give you an example. If you have low blood sugar, there is a hormone that helps to raise your blood sugar. It's called glucagon. Glucagon is released in response to low blood sugar. That's a nutrient in your bloodstream. It responds to humoral stimulation. Let's talk about another. If we're thinking about blood sodium levels, if you have high blood sodium levels, you may want to lower them. So humoral stimulation is going to control the release of hormones that help to manage sodium. So sodium ion concentration, glucose concentration, those types of things are great examples because we're talking blood concentration of those ions or nutrients. Let's talk about neural stimulation. In this case, the nervous system stimulates the release of a hormone from nerves. Now, if that hormone were to travel directly from the axon terminal to a neighboring cell, that would then be called a neurotransmitter. But because this hormone is released into the bloodstream, it is then called a hormone and not a neurotransmitter. Oxytocin works this way. We look at ADH working this way as well. So there's epinephrine, norepinephrine that also travels into this category. And sometimes, in some cases, there are more than one stimuli that will help to release a hormone from its gland. Finally, hormonal stimuli. Don't confuse that term. It is spelled really similar to the first term. Hormonal stimuli is when we have one hormone from one gland stimulating another gland to release a hormone. This is very common with, say, pituitary gland and their target organs. For instance, thyroid stimulating hormone is released by your anterior pituitary, and it targets your thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. I kind of think of this as passing the buck. So we'll talk about examples of these. This is not the last time we'll discuss as we go through this chapter. Now, if you'll follow me to the next particular topic, we're going to talk next about hypothalamus and pituitary. That will start on page 6 of your course pack.